Hello. Our screen is frozen. I don't know if that's a problem or not.
Oh, I think it's going now.
Now it's going.
So we're just going to keep talking. If this thing cuts off at some point, we're just going to keep rolling.
And it'll probably come back on.
Yeah, it'll probably come back on. So, how are you guys doing today? How are you doing today?
I'm doing okay. I'm a little bit chilly. It's cold back in this room.
It is cold in this room. It is freezing in this room.
We're at that time of year.
Mm-hmm. I think it's going down.
But it's a good time of year.
Yeah.
You can always put on a jacket.
Right.
You can't always just take off a layer. So I like how it gets cool and then it gets warm right now. So
yeah. It's supposed to be like 77
like
today or
season.
something today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, Brenda. Brenda just said hi.
Yep. Brenda's on. Scott Anderson is on. So, let's talk about politics.
Yay!
Let's talk about the death penalty.
Isn't that how we started a couple weeks ago?
Yeah, it is. So we got
the season.
Yeah, we got a question, and it was from Sunday's message, and we like questions. Yeah, we do. Let me find it. I have too many things open on my phone. Let me find this question. We actually got this question.
That line was booking me.
Pretty quickly on Sunday morning. Actually, during the message on Sunday morning, it came across, I think.
Okay.
Yeah. So we read from Genesis 9 this week. Was one of the texts we read from, and we talked. Kind of the overall theme for Sunday was the separation of church and state. So the church has a role within society, and the state has a role within society. And the way I presented it, at least, was they should really stay away from each other.
So those two roles are different.
Those two roles are different.
Church is different than state.
Right. So the state has a job, and the church has a job.
Yeah.
And I'm using those words kind of loosely.
Right.
But yeah, so they're two separate things. And that could be a controversial concept in 2020. Could be. For some people, that could be controversial.
Well, and how you play that out, I think, is pretty controversial for a lot of people. It was really controversial in the 1700s when people left England because they wanted a state that was separate from the church.
Right.
And started what we live in now.
So...
Go ahead.
Like things we just don't ever talk about until we get in this room. So what you just so for the people who don't really know like the details of what you're talking about, in England, the king, or in 21st century, the queen, is the head of the Church of England.
And the state of England.
And the state. So, yeah, at that point in history, the king was the head of the Church of England and the head of England itself. So people left England in a roundabout way, left England to get away from that piece.
Yeah.
And there were also, okay, so I know I posted a link last week on my Facebook page, and I included it in the email from Francis Schaeffer. And I'm sure that all of you, when you saw that email, you could not wait to watch a 30-minute long video clip of Francis Schaeffer. And he really does a good job of explaining kind of that trajectory of how the United States was founded on this principle of the separation of church and state and where that came from. So I would encourage you, like if you are just so fascinated by this topic, you should go, I would recommend that you go back and watch that. So anyway, separation of church and state, two separate things. And we talked about the way we talked about government was three things, three responsibilities: to render judgment for the sake of justice, to build platforms of peace, order, and flourishing, and to set the stage for redemption. And then we read from Genesis chapter 9. And I'll require the blood of anyone who takes another person's life. If a wild animal kills a person, it must die, and anyone who murders a fellow human must die. If anyone takes a human life, that person's life will also be taken by human hands. For God made human beings in his own image. Now be fruitful and multiply and repopulate the earth. I love that. I love that little caveat at the end. Now go! Don't kill anybody. And if somebody does, you, Noah, people, government, have the authority to take that life. Am I taking that too far?
I don't think so. I mean, it's interesting because we start off talking about a separation of powers. There's the church that has a societal role and the state that has a societal role. And now we're reading a passage in which there was no church or state.
Yeah.
And so I think we need to be careful how we overlap that onto a state and church type of issue, because this passage was spoken into existence, so to speak, at a time when there was no church and there was no state. And this instruction was an instruction given to Noah at the outset of a reformation of society.
Right.
After society as a whole had gone very wrong. The world was a mess. And this was a reordering, so to speak. And so at the outset of that reordering, government systems were non-existent. And so at a very basic level, this is God saying, don't kill people.
Yeah.
Don't murder each other. It's pretty basic. It's not that hard to not murder somebody.
Right.
I think that's just something to keep in mind as we dig into this passage. Background always matters. Context always matters. And we don't live in that context. We do have a church now, and we do have a state now, that are shaped by very different circumstances than the ones that Noah lived in.
Right.
But also are shaped by the consequences of sin.
Yeah.
That was the same in Noah's day. And that's a problem. It's still a problem. And I think Noah was given some ways to deal with the consequences of sin. We have been given some ways to deal with the results and consequences of sin, both ours and others. And how we overlap that is a pretty intricate and delicate thing in some ways. So that's a preface.
Yeah. And one of the things that we talked about, I think a lot of so we've called this Q&A, and that's probably not the best thing. It probably, someone else calls theirs a Q&R, and that probably might actually be more faithful to what happens, like question and response. So I mean, if we were to read through, if we were to start right there at Genesis, we would read through the rest of the Old Testament, and we would see the development of systems and structures for,
right.
To break it down, we would see the development of systems and structures over time to where government / the state takes on a great, people begin to organize, and that is, So people begin to build platforms of peace, order, and flourishing, and maybe not so much peace, and maybe not flourishing, but order. And I think the way I talked about it was like somebody has to decide what side of the road we're going to drive on.
Yeah.
So as cities were built, or like however that looked in Old Testament times, someone had to implement structure and order. Because without that, like you said when we were sitting in my office, Judges at least twice, and I think more than that, 3 times, maybe even 4, says something like, at the time when there were no kings, essentially the people did whatever they wanted to, and it was chaos. That did not lead to peace, order, and flourishing. It led to chaos.
Right. When everyone does what is right in their own eyes, it ends up being a mess because we don't see things the same.
Right.
If you think we all see things the same, then you haven't been paying attention.
Right.
Because there are all kinds of issues right now with people looking at exactly the same thing and writing a completely different story about what's happening.
Yeah.
And I think, well, yeah, this will not be a very satisfactory, and maybe that's why you said a question and response instead of question and answer. This discussion is not going to have a very satisfactory answer, probably for anybody.
Including
us. I would say, including me. I'm not very satisfied with how I can, at this moment, answer this question. Because I think it's a question that comes out of response to situations that shouldn't exist.
Yeah.
And we haven't read the question yet, so that's a little bit vague, but
yeah,
we'll get there.
Yeah, so the question was, so Genesis 9 seems to indicate if someone is murdered, then they need to pay with their own blood. I think the murderer needs to pay with their own blood.
Got it.
So if I commit murder, if I kill someone, then an appropriate response of an authority is to kill me. Is that fair? Like, am I?
Yeah, I think that's a fair reading of what that passage says.
So this person asked the question, so Genesis 9 requires blood for blood. Does this mean we are not addressing punishment for murder appropriately as a nation? Does this mean we, as the United States, so I kind of followed up a little bit with this person, are we not addressing murder appropriately as a nation? And this question, it probably hits all the buttons. If that depends on, so you're going to have a lot of different responses, which is why we might just change what this is called. I think so then we go into the New Testament and we see all sorts of things. We're going to talk about Romans 13, so I'm not going to give you this week's sermon because it's still in the process of being written. I think in our conversation, what we came down to was, does government have the authority? So I'll just ask a series of questions. Does government have the authority to take a life? Under a given set of circumstances, do you believe government has the authority to take a life?
Yeah, I think our government has detailed that. I think our government is set up in a way that they have claimed that authority. Whether I think they have that authority or not,
sure,
they have claimed that authority and set up structures in place to exercise that authority when due process has concluded that should be exercised.
Okay.
So in short, we live in a country that has a death penalty that is exercised sometimes. Whether or not that's exercised uniformly or appropriately, accurately, consistently, those are all questions that we could debate for years and years and years. But we do have the death penalty that has been applied to murderers, both at the state level, at the federal level. Not in every state, I would say. I don't actually know. I didn't look this up. I don't know how many states have their own policies about the death penalty, or how many have death penalty and how many don't.
Sure.
We do have a federal death penalty as well. Actually, we were looking at some stats and kind of surprised at how it has and has not been applied over the years.
Yeah.
So whether it's applied fairly, that's a debate.
Right.
Consistently, that's
Right.
a debate.
Right.
But yes, we do have a death penalty in our nation. And I think, yeah, go ahead.
And yeah, so government has, so what I'm hearing you say is government has the right, like, from not only from Genesis 9, but if we were to look through the totality of Scripture, we would see that government has the right to take a life. Like that is their spot. They have to use force, to wield the sword, whatever phrase we would use for that. Like that's government's role.
Yeah.
So they have that right. And then the other question is, well then, so does the church have that right? Is that the role of the church to act to be the sword on our society? Is that the role of the church?
I would say it's definitely not the role of the church.
And we would agree. So again, this is response. There's a lot of nuance in this, but generally speaking, we agree that government has the right to wield the sword, and generally speaking, we agree that the church does not have the right to wield the sword because they function in two different ways.
Yes, and I would add that anytime the church is trying to apply its right to something, we're on kind of shaky ground, and we need to be really careful that we don't get derailed from what our responsibility is to the world while we're holding to our rights.
Right.
That probably is a whole nother conversation.
Yeah.
So let's go back to this.
So then, I'm going to reread the question.
Okay.
Does this mean we're not addressing punishment for murder appropriately as a nation? So the we, like our context is the United States of America. So we Americans, we can't answer for other nations. We can only answer for our nation.
Right.
As Americans, we can answer that. I think we can answer that question as Americans. Or we can respond to it. How about that? I'm going to let us off the hook. We can respond. Like, I think you bring up all of these other questions that are legitimate to bring up. So what are the situations and circumstances behind things? We talked about due process. The way I approach this question is like recognizing that we live in a time where however old you think the earth is, and however long you think man has been here and all of those kinds of things, we live in a time that's really a historical anomaly. Like the things that I think about this are things like due process. I think about things like, so what are rights? I think about things like jury trials and judges. And I think about, I think about like my lens to look at this question. I'm seeing this question through lots of things that I know I'm bringing to this. And throughout history, that necessarily wasn't the case.
Yeah.
So we tend to ask questions like and you asked this, like, is the death penalty fairly implemented? What are the things that are taken into consideration when the death penalty is used? Like one of the things we found was, I don't remember what the number was, but just this year it was I think it was 4 or 5 federal executions have taken place.
7.
7.
There have been 10, I think, since like 1963, and 7 of those have been in the last July, August, September, October.
Okay.
So 4 months.
Yeah, so 7 of the last 10 federal executions have happened in the last 5 months. So, like, what's your question when
and
we were
it's
sitting in
not
my
because
office?
no one has been murdered and no one has done murder, but also that's only federal. So if you murder someone in one state, their justice system in that state that is independently governed by its own structures may be different than the next state over.
Right.
And so we looked a little bit at the federal one because this question says as a nation.
Right.
And so there are some circumstances that have brought certain cases into the federal jurisdiction rather than only a state jurisdiction.
Right.
And I honestly, I haven't researched these enough
Right.
to know what all of those were. Like, why did this case go to a federal trial instead of just being tried in its own state? So I would, yeah, there are so many conditions on these things. We do have blood for blood examples, like literally of this passage being acted upon by our nation. We also have examples where the violation has occurred without the same punishment. And honestly, I don't know what has made the difference from one case to another for a lot of those.
Right. So if you came on here today hoping that we were going to either tell you what to do when it comes to the death penalty, like, we're not going to do that. So that's helping you manage your expectations.
I said this probably wasn't going to be a very satisfying conversation.
And as you also said, for us either. You brought up the scene in Scripture, John 8, of the woman caught in adultery. She's thrown at the feet of Jesus.
My first thought at kind of reading this question went to that. This woman is caught violating the law. She was guilty, and the law said, here's what her punishment is. And so some men, motivated not by a sense of justice, I believe, but by a sense of how can we trap Jesus in his words, they take this woman and they throw her in front of Jesus and says, okay, here's what the law tells us we should do to this woman who has been caught violating it. What do you say? And Jesus' answer to her was pretty wise. Jesus knew what the law said, and he knew what their hearts were also. And he just said, let the first one who is without sin be the first one to cast the stone. He said, okay, let's go by what the law says. But whichever of you is not also guilty of violating the law, you be the one to exact the punishment of the law. And I think for me that brings a whole new level of thinking into the situation. Jesus' primary concern was not crime and punishment. And so my primary concern probably should not be crime and punishment.
As an individual Christian.
As an individual Christian, yes.
Okay.
Now, if I'm an individual Christian who's been called into an area of service that involves crime and punishment, then yeah, that should be something that I'm concerned with and I spend a lot more time than I do on. I think if, for example, on Sunday, as you were speaking, I was standing in the back, and our former mayor was standing, a healthy social distance away from me. And I remember this thought just came into my mind. When we talk about these things, does that sound different for Christians who are called into political service? And when I talk about myself being not very politically active, that does not imply that every Christian should not be politically active. I believe that Christians should be politically involved. And some Christians are called into a deeper level of service to our society through political avenues. And so, if I've been called into law enforcement, or if I've been called into the political arena, I should study those things more than I should as someone who's been called into the area of service that I'm in.
Right.
And so I got to admit, coming into this conversation from a certain level of ignorance, because I've not dug into all the nuances of our legal system's approach to the death penalty and how those may or may not reflect truth found in Scripture. I have spent a lot of time digging into how does Jesus interact with people who violate the law. And because I interact with people who violate the law, and I don't just mean like speeding, and I mean we interact with people who sin all the time, because that's the only kind of people that there are.
Mm-hmm.
And how did Jesus approach them? And how does he call us to approach them? I think when we talk about the death penalty, obviously from a governmental side of things, if the death penalty is enacted on a murderer, that eliminates any chance that that offense is going to be repeated by that offender. And it probably is a deterrent to some other defenders or offenders, potential offenders, because they know there's a huge price to pay.
Right.
Sorry, that's a little bit of a sidebar, but
well, I think if we would have had this conversation, if we would have had this conversation 25 years ago, and someone were to have asked me this question,
that'd be different because I knew everything 25 years
right,
ago.
exactly, yeah. 25 years ago, I would have argued pretty strongly that because the death penalty was not universally applied, it really didn't serve as any sort of deterrent. Like, that's how I would have argued that.
Yeah.
And like, whatever category you think that puts me in for the death penalty now, like, you can think whatever you want to. And I'm not going to tell you. I know I would have argued that. And 25 years later, I would say that I think there's some element of truth to that too. Like, I still might have that conversation, and I'm cautious to not have that conversation right now. Like, I still might have that conversation, but I wonder, like, I know there have been instances of things like wrongful prosecution. Because I live in a country that has been shaped by certain things, like, it makes me wonder why isn't it universally applied? What does it look? So again, what does due process look like? What does trial by jury look like? All of these things that now I have categories for that I really didn't think much about.
Right. I think the idea of it being a deterrent. There definitely, some of those criticisms are valid.
Yeah.
I think there is at least some level of deterrence about having a death penalty. But as an individual Christian, I want to shape a world where the death penalty is not necessary as a deterrent because we have so infused our culture with the value of life
Yeah.
that we don't need to deter people from killing other people because we all value life so much that no one thinks of doing that. Now, I know that's a utopian, ideal kind of thinking. But I think what we're called to do is, as individual Christians and as a body of Christians, is to be a beachhead for a coming kingdom that is an ideal and sort of utopian place. A place where life is valued so deeply that no one thinks of that.
Right.
Like, the idea of murder is just so far out of our value that we don't need to deter people from murdering. We don't live in that world right now. We live in a world where life is not valued. And in some cases, life is actively and violently devalued in every way possible. As a body of Christ and as a disciple of Christ, my role and yours, if you're his disciple, is to do whatever we can to bring people to the Savior who can change their heart set, who can change their mindset and reshape them to value life the way that he does.
And government, that was one of the things we talked about on Sunday. Government can't do that.
Government can't do that.
They cannot. See, government can't change the heart. All government can do is bring the sword. Which is like, there's this, I've been trying to figure out, like, this is one of the challenges of this series has been knowing about what to talk about and how much to talk about. See, all government can do is bring a cascading of more and more rules and regulations and more laws to restrict mankind. That's all government has. That's all government can do. So, and I'm sure I'm going to sound like either a libertarian or a right-wing Republican right now in what I'm about to say. Like, all government can do is create more and more laws. Because when we as mankind do whatever is right in our own eyes, the only fix for them is more rules and regulations. And they are going to back that up with the sword. So like when and this is where I want to be caught. This is where I'm going to sound like a liberal. I'm going to sound like a Democrat. Like there are people in our society who are concerned about what they maybe would call like an increasingly militarized police force.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's because that's how you enforce. Like, if you want to enforce a law, that's how you enforce the law.
If you want to enforce a law that someone doesn't want to follow, you have to be stronger than them in order to enforce that.
Right.
If you want to impose your will on somebody else who has their own will, you can only do that if you are stronger than them.
Right. Or unless you change their heart.
Or if you can change their heart. And government can't do that.
Right.
Government can force. Maybe government can manipulate or entice. But government cannot change anyone's heart.
Right. No matter how hard they try. And I think this like really gets philosophical. I think they try to change their hearts, but they can't. So then they use force, because that's the only weapon they have at their disposal. Is if you don't do what they say, and this is all about what we're going to talk about on Sunday, they're going to bring the sword. They're going to bring the heat, because that's how they have to keep you. That's how they have to keep us in line. And I'm sure now I'm sounding like a right-wing crazy person, right? Who is anti-government and But this is, without being political, this is grounded, like what we're talking about is not the things we hear and see on Facebook about, and this isn't an anti-government Facebook rant. This is talking about what we see in Scripture about how government's not enough to really resolve our problems. And the whole point on Sunday was not whether or not government has the authority to do the death penalty. The whole point on Sunday was government is limited in what it can accomplish. And if we put our hope and trust in that thing, we're never going to find satisfaction.
Yeah. I think ultimately a government would enact a death penalty in order to prevent further loss of life. But what if there was a way that we could change people's hearts before they murdered someone?
Right.
That's where the church can come in, because we are called to bring people to the one that can transform them. And I think even as we talk about political issues and election issues and all the sociology that goes into all of that, we want to be mindful that we can't stop short of bringing people to transformation, because really what we want is not just behavior modification, and that's what the punishment for crime is aimed at, behavior modification.
So here's an example of that. If the speed limit is 75, and if I go faster than that, I get a ticket. They just want to. They're not interested in. The government is not interested in my morality of going less than 75. They just don't want me to go 70. They just don't want me to go 76. So that ticket is to modify my behavior. It doesn't change my heart. So
a mom might make cookies and the kid wants to steal a cookie. Those cookies aren't for you. I'm taking those cookies to our neighbor. Don't take those cookies. But I want those cookies. Don't take those cookies or I will spank you. That is behavior modification. Here's the law set in stone. What if that kid recognized, I love my neighbor so much that I want them to have these cookies? Then the law is not necessary. And I'm not going into we need an anarchy type of...
Right.
That's not what I mean when I say that law was not necessary. But ultimately, the transformation that Jesus can make and really is the only thing that can make some of the laws that are so controversial, make them unnecessary. You know who you don't have to tell to not murder somebody? Someone that loves their neighbor.
Right.
Someone that just doesn't have that hate in their heart. Because they've been transformed by Christ.
Yeah. So here's just thinking about this, here's another example. So for those of you that have been around me for more than a week, I'm a runner. I don't need the state to tell me that when I stop at a stop sign, I have to look both ways because it's the law. I don't. You know why I don't have to do that? Because as a runner, when I approach a stop sign, I'll be generous. 75% of the drivers are not looking for me on the road. I don't, most of the time, when I stop at a stop sign, I'm looking all over the place. Because as a person who's a runner, I care about other people and I don't want to hit someone. So I am trying, in that instance, and there are 1,000 other ways where I don't love my neighbor. But in this, I think that's a really good analogy of, when I'm driving down the street in my neighborhood, I don't go 25 miles an hour because there's a sign there. I go whatever the speed limit is or less than, because there are families with kids who live on my street.
Yeah.
See, that's a change. That's a changed heart, and that's why, like, when I am driving down my street, and I look at my speedometer, and I see I'm not going 25. I see I'm going 40. My first thought is, oh my goodness, what am I doing? Not because I'm afraid that a police officer is going to give me a ticket, but what happens if a child runs out in front of me? Like, what you're talking about is how do we create that society? And I mean, the role of the church is to point people to Jesus, to see transformed hearts and transformed lives. And that's like, as we look at what we are to be doing as Christians, that's our goal, is to help people be changed. And like, you can give government all that authority to execute people, and they have that authority. And I would argue now, even if you... So now I'm going to sound the exact opposite of what I would have said 25 years ago. If tomorrow every state in the country would literally execute everyone on death row, I don't think it would make a bit of difference. Maybe
As far as deterring,
maybe for the next week things might change. But I know my own sinful behavior.
we are so quick to return to it.
Like, I can stop something for 10 minutes and be fine. And then, like, oh yeah, like, I feel bad, I feel guilty. And then I'm like, oh, I'm just going to go back and do that thing again. I don't, as much as maybe 25 years ago, I would have argued, well, the death penalty is not a deterrent because it's not universally applied. 25 years later, I would say if they killed everyone on death row, it wouldn't matter. In the grand scheme of things, other than maybe a temporary...
Right. There would be a temporary difference.
behavioral change. I just don't think it would matter.
Because as soon as mom's not looking anymore, and I think I can get that cookie without getting caught, if my heart's not changed, maybe I'm going for that cookie.
Right.
And yeah, behavior modification only goes so far.
Right.
We need the heart transformation that Christ can do. And as disciples, every single one of us has some responsibility in that direction.
Yeah.
Some of us are also called into areas of service politically and socially where we may or may not, we may have more to say on legal matters and crime and punishment type of matters. But every single one of us is called to put God on full display and make sure every one of our neighbors has access to a clear picture of who God is and the transformation that he can make in their lives.
Yeah, I am far less interested in behavior modification at this point and far more interested in seeing people actually live transformed lives. And I know, like, from my when I was in student ministry, I remember I had this moment of our ministry, we were reaching a lot of kids who were not from church backgrounds. And there was sort of this moment that happened over a period of like 2 months where I recognized, like, man, if all we're doing is getting these kids here on a Wednesday night and changing their behavior for an hour and a half when they're here, and then they go home and they run into situations and circumstances where, like, they just default right back to whatever those patterns are. We're not making any, like, it's not that it doesn't matter, because it does matter, because proclaiming the gospel does matter. And pointing people to Jesus does matter. But in the grand scheme of things, like, I didn't want just well-behaved children in my student ministry. and like, I know enough about you. You don't want just well-behaved kids in our family ministries here at Westway.
Right.
We want people who have been transformed. And government at its best is behavior modification.
Yeah.
And at its worst, it's tyranny. And that's a political statement. I just went there. And the church is at its best heart transformation and at its worst, behavior modification.
Yeah.
And we want to see...
So the church at its worst is the same as the state at its best. I said that.
I think that's legitimate. And recognizing that doesn't... So even at our best, and like this really gets like into deep theology. Like I don't remember which prophet it is, but your righteousness is as filthy rags.
Yeah.
So even at our best, from a behavior modification standpoint, compared to what God offers from a transformed heart, it doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
And the goal, Okay, I need to ponder this more. Okay.
You're probably starting to see the smoke and...
Yeah, I think, yeah.
So there's a lot of gears turning in this room right now.
That's good. The government at its best is actually the church at its worst.
Huh.
Okay. Somebody made a comment, so...
Thanks for the response. Thanks, Virginia.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. So... This is like what I like about this. There's lots of things I like about this. This is how we develop wisdom. The other day, John told me we were in our kitchen after we got home on Sunday, and John said, "I appreciated the way that you talked about how you developed your political thought without actually telling us what your political thought is." Because this is how we create wisdom. And this is what we talked about the first week of this series, like over time and experience and reading and studying the Bible and talking to other people and interacting people. Like this is how we develop this stuff. And I know I've harped on it for the last 2 weeks, and I'm sure I'm going to say it again this week. This is why things like voter guides are just so eminently they don't do anything to change my heart.
Yeah, and I think this is another example of us valuing heart transformation more than behavior modification.
Yeah.
I don't want you to vote a certain way just because that's what I told you I do or what I told you should do. I don't want my kids to obey me just because this is what I said. I don't want them to think a certain way. I know that sounds weird from a parent, but I don't want them to think a certain way just because I say this is how you should think. I want them to think through, and I want their thinking to be shaped by Christ.
Right.
More than it's shaped by me. And that's because I don't have the capacity to rescue my kids or anyone else that I love from their sin. And Christ does. I don't have the capacity to build a just society where crime doesn't happen. Christ does.
Yeah. And
so I want to influence people toward Christ in every way I possibly can.
Right. And that might put you at odds with whatever state you happen to live in.
Yeah.
So following the way of Christ, and this will be a lead into Sunday. Following the way of Christ might put me against the state. Or might put the state against me.
Yeah.
And then I have to...
And I would say throughout history, that has probably been the norm.
Yeah.
More than our experience, where we've generally been free to worship as we see fit and to follow Christ to the fullest of our capacity.
Right.
Out in the open, freely. We might get criticized for it. We might get whatever, but we've had that freedom in our nation in ways that has not been the norm throughout the last 2,000 years all over the world.
Yeah. And like, I'll give some credit. Like, I know it's cool to trash people who lived 300 years ago. And to their credit, I think in a lot of ways our founders really understood some things that were probably wiser in their understanding than maybe what we give them credit for. And this is like, now I'm sounding like pro-America, right? Like our founders were pretty wise in the way they created our government to function in terms of roles and responsibilities. And then there's a whole bunch of ways where our founders, I think, botched it because they're human beings.
Because they're human beings.
So, so this week we're going to talk about Romans 13, verses 1 to 7, and a few other verses. And we're going to dig more into the concept of the sword. And then how do we, like this week it was, there's two separate things. Government does this, Christians do that. Christians are salt and light. And then this week we're going to talk about what it means when government is the sword. How do we ambassador Jesus? And what does that look like living in our reality?
Yeah.
So, love for you to read Romans 13, 1 to 7 before you come on Sunday. And that's what we're going to talk about. So, if you have other questions, we want you to reach out to us so that we can respond to them rather than answer.
I like that, respond.
Yep. I used to hate it when somebody would say that. There's a person I follow. I used to follow on Facebook, and he always called his things Q&R. It would drive me nuts, but now I get it. So thanks for watching. We love you guys. I want you to know we're praying for you as you navigate this time right now. As you navigate this, this is tough stuff. I wish it were as easy as here's a voter guide, just do this thing. But that's just not the Christian life.
Yeah. Hey, I want to mention one thing.
Yes.
Coming up, as we move forward, we are restarting our children's ministries. We've got our nursery and our wee ones going. Those always can use more help, but we also are looking to get restarted with our next several age groups up through 5th grade on Sunday mornings. And so if you have any interest in helping with those, please give me a call or send me an email here at the church, and I'll have a form set up very soon that you can just sign up there as well. We're going to have a team train on October 28th to talk about some new curriculum that we're going to be using and kind of get everybody familiar with the way that we're going to proceed.
Right.
In light of the corona situation that we're in and all of that. But bigger picture, what are we trying to accomplish?
Yeah.
No matter what our circumstances are, our children need to be discipled.
Right.
And so
right.
What are we going to do to disciple children, to help our parents disciple children? And so that's going to be on the 28th. If you want to watch here for more information, that will be coming up very soon. And please be praying for the team to come together the way that it needs to.
Right.
And if you want to roll on that team, give me a call.
Yeah, we're excited. This is a key part of our as we regather. I mean, this is such a key part of our regathering right now. I'm going to use the word normal. Not the new normal. I'm going to use the word normal, but this is part of a disciple-making children's ministry is part of who we want to be as a church. And this would be a return to normal. I was watching football on Saturday, and I felt guilty because I was just laying on my couch after my wife got home from work. And I said, is there something you want me to be doing right now? And she said, no. Football on Saturday, this is a sense of normalcy for me to see you doing this. So this makes me feel good that you're doing something normal. Children's ministry is just a key part of our regathering. So we're going to be talking a lot about it over the next few weeks, and changing hearts and minds and molding them or being transformed by Jesus. And that's what we want to do with kids and with everyone for that matter, because that's what makes a difference. So so thanks for watching. We will see you guys on Sunday morning, if not before. And one more thing, it's Shane and Miranda Coop's anniversary, and I meant to say that at the very beginning of this. If you are on Facebook, I would encourage you to hop over to Shane and Miranda's Facebook page.
Yeah.
Hop on the Scoop on Coop and just wish them happy anniversary. That would be a way to honor them today. So I would love it if you would do that. So now we're done. Thanks for watching. We love you guys. I will see you later this week.
See you later.